Good morning and welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. This is one of those days where I think I've spent too much time trying to explain to folks why Thomas Jefferson should not be canceled and why the idea of academic rigor should probably not be dismissed as just a artifact of white maleness. But I don't know. These are the times that we live in. Like people, could we focus on what actually matters? And one of the stories that I want to focus on today is something that I have been thinking about for the last several years, trying to figure out what has happened to American journalism outside of the elite precincts. I mean, we live in the best of times and the worst of times. I think that you could argue that right now we're seeing some of the best journalism of our lives coming from places like the New York Times, the Washington Post. But also, at the same time, you have the gutting of newsrooms all across the country, the creation of these vast news deserts where there may not be any newspapers, or the newspapers that used to exist don't even rise to the level of shadows of their former self. And there is a cover story in the Atlantic magazine that really captures some of what's going on here. It is a fascinating and, I will say, depressing read. And the author joins me, welcoming back McKay Coppins to the podcast. Welcome back, McKay.
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
So I'm really not going to make any comments about the chirpy Midwestern accent thing. I promised I wasn't. I want you to know that I've gotten past it. I'm over it.
Do you think your listeners have gotten to the point where they've heard you complain about this enough that
No.
it's just shorthand, or is this just your own?
I just leave it to people to decide. No, once for people who don't know what I'm talking about, which I assume is, I'm hoping 90%. McKay did an article about the Bulwark back when we were just beginning and commented on my chirpy Midwestern accent. So it stuck with me.
Look, I report, you decide. We'll let the readers decide whether that was an accurate description.
I will just leave that there. But anyway, this piece is really remarkable. This is a great work of journalism about journalism. A secretive hedge fund is gutting newsrooms, and it's about the hedge fund called Alden Global Capital, which now controls more than 200 newspapers, a lot of them small newspapers, but also, some of these iconic publications like the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, the New York Daily News. And so this hedge fund has become the second largest newspaper owner by circulation in the country, and is one of the biggest employers of journalists in the country. And again, I've read about them occasionally as sort of the bad guys, the takeover artists that come in and gut the newspapers, but I've never read the detail that you have here, McKay. So just tell me about the folks behind Alden, the men behind this hedge fund, and why it makes business sense. And maybe we'll get to this over the course of the podcast. Makes business sense to drive the papers into the ground, which seems counterintuitive to me. So who are these people and why are they doing it?
Yeah, this is the interesting thing about this subject, right? When I started working on this story a few months ago, one of the things I ran into was that I felt like, and I think most people feel like, they already know the story of declining local news, right? Like everybody feels like they know why local newspapers are dying. Craigslist killed the classified section, and Google and Facebook dominated the ad market, and all these newspapers basically failed to adapt to the internet, and that's why we are where we're at. And there is obviously truth to all those things. Those are all important factors. But what I don't think a lot of people realize is that in this weakened state of local journalism, there have been these very aggressive, ruthless hedge funds like Alden Global Capital that have decided to exploit the fact that these newspapers are in the state that they're in and are basically killing them off, right? So Alden is what is known in financial circles as a vulture hedge fund. They focus on distressed assets, which is to say businesses that are either in bankruptcy or seem to be heading that way. And they buy them at bargain prices and figure out how to make money by either breaking them into pieces or, various other strategies that are employed. What Alden does very well is they have developed a model to essentially make profit and make a lot of money for their investors by driving these newspapers into the ground. And the model is pretty straightforward. When they buy a local newspaper, they gut the staff, they sell any real estate that the newspaper owns. They, in many cases, increase subscription prices. There's a theory that they realize that subscribers will not notice for a certain period of time that they're getting a worse product and paying more for it. And then they'll find other ways to increase profit margins in the short term. So, in some cases, they have outsourced layout design to the Philippines. They often move the reporters and editors to kind of small, depressing digs attached to the printing press, and all of this is done to maximize short-term profits.
Short
Basically,
term.
wring as much cash as possible out of these publications that it can without worrying about the long-term viability of the papers. And that's the key point I just want to make. For Alden and its investors to make money, they don't need these newspapers to be long-term sustainable
Hmm.
businesses. All they need to do is take enough money out of the
Squeeze it.
properties that it exceeds the amount they paid for them, right? And then it'll show up on their ledger as a winning investment, a profitable investment. And if the newspapers eventually fold or are consolidated or reduced to kind of desiccated husks, that's fine by them because they can move on to other investments.
This is what's extraordinary about it. I mean, this is sort of the ugly face of capitalism here, that they just sort of squeeze it out to get these short-term profits. This is not a turner. This is not your classic turnaround,
Mm-hmm.
acquisition where you buy something and then you fix it up, you make it better. They buy it to gut it, and eventually in the midterm or long term to kill it. And as you point out, all of this is happening without us knowing much about these guys. I mean, they tend to be, opaque. I mean, in general, hedge funds are opaque, but Alden really is secret. I mean, so
Yes.
who are these guys behind it? I mean,
The,
Randall Smith, Heath Freeman,
yeah.
who are these guys?
Yeah, the Alden, I would say, is much even more secretive than the average hedge fund. So, the two guys that you have to kind of know about to understand what Alden is doing are Randall Smith and Heath Freeman. Randall Smith was a sort of pioneering vulture capitalist before the term was even invented. Back in the 70s and 80s, he was on a partner track at Bear Stearns and had this insight. He was one of the first people to realize that there was money to be made, big money to be made, by buying distressed companies and basically selling them off in pieces, right? So he started his own little firm, made a massive fortune doing this with, a bankrupt aerospace manufacturer, with a Dallas drilling company, and became a very polarizing figure on Wall Street. I actually found a a profile of him in the New York Times from the '90s, where he was described as somebody who excelled at profiting off other people's misery. So he was this very polarizing figure, but his insight was basically right. He made a lot of money doing what he did, and I think something that a lot of people don't know about him, even those who have kind of followed him closely, is that even though he was making money in all these other sectors, he had a kind of personal interest in the media sector.
Hmm.
He in the '90s took his own money and helped his brother launch an alt weekly in Manhattan that was called the New York Press, and it was run by a guy named Russ Smith. That's Randall Smith's brother,
Hmm.
who was this kind of mischievous, troublemaking libertarian whose defining ethos for his publication was contempt for the journalistic class.
Huh.
He actually told the New York Magazine, "I'm repulsed by the incestuous nature of New York journalism." He wrote
Interesting.
a weekly column called Mugger that basically went after New York City journalists by name in witheringly personal terms. And I think it's interesting to look back at this as one of the earliest media investments made by Randall Smith, because it was essentially conceived of as a giant middle finger to journalism. Randall Smith, since then, has become much more reclusive. He moved to Palm Beach. At one point, owned 16 mansions in
Okay,
Palm
wait,
Beach.
16. It's 16.
He is that kind of wealthy person.
He has more mansions than I have pairs of shoes.
Yeah, I mean, many more in
So
my case.
he's doing well.
He also has was a major donor to Donald Trump's presidential campaign,
This shocks me.
which which might give you some insight into how he sees the media. Although again, he hasn't given an interview since the mid 1980s, so he really has never explained himself, never articulated his view of journalism or the media or anything else like that. But that is the guy who really is the founder of Alden Capital, along with his protege Heath Freeman. And Heath Freeman, just briefly, basically is a he was described to me as a sort of prototypical Wall Street frat boy, the finance bro. It's a clear type. He's the kind of guy who would show up at meetings straight from the gym wearing, sweats or athleisure. He liked to brag about his college football career, where just as a brief fact check, he was a walk-on place kicker at Duke on a team that actually won no games during the year that he played.
Won no games. Okay.
Zero,
Oh,
zero games. But anyway, he basically runs the firm on a day-to-day basis. He's the president of the firm. And if you talk to people who have been in meetings with him, former publishers of Alden-owned newspapers, they will say that he was a very feared figure in these meetings. He would hector publishers, demand that they produce numbers off the top of their heads, during the meetings. But his directives to them always was cut more, find more ways to cut. And, as you can imagine, that didn't go over well necessarily in the newsrooms that he owned, where the people I spoke to said that he often exhibited a sort of contempt for the journalists who worked there.
mm-hmm.
He once allegedly would ask, "What do all these people do?" There was one story that might be apocryphal that circulated around the company, that when the Denver Post, which is owned by Alden, won a Pulitzer Prize and he was informed of it, his first response was, "Does that come with any money?" And so the general sense is that these two guys are people who, at best, are sort of indifferent to journalism, and at worst might be actively hostile to it or have a certain amount of
Okay,
animus
so
toward it.
this is what I found most interesting, because there's always been this question in my mind about whether or not you're just dealing with 7-year-olds running around the China shop with hammers and they're just, destroying things that they don't really understand, or whether it's purposeful. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So you write, and I want to come back to the Chicago Tribune and what they've done to the Chicago Tribune. So they had this, aggressive round of buyouts, and the exodus included, according to your story, the Metro columnist who championed the occupants of a troubled public housing complex, the editor who maintained a homicide database that the police couldn't manipulate, and the investigative reporter who helped expose the governor's offshore shell companies. So this is not just trimming fat. I guess that's where I come back to it. So it is like an almost, well, you have a sense of a purposeful destruction of the heart of the journalistic enterprises that they take over.
So this is kind of the core question,
Yeah.
in both circles of people who have worked with Freeman or have worked at Alden, and general industry observers, right? The debate is, are these guys just kind of straightforward capitalists who
Right.
have figured out a way to make a buck and they
Right.
don't care what this does to the newsrooms that they own or to the communities that those newspapers serve? They're just trying to make money. Or is it something kind of more hostile, right? Is it something more
Right.
nefarious? And I can't say that I can answer for sure. I think that there's definitely evidence, especially in the case of Randall Smith. You could posit, you could speculate that the dismantling of these newsrooms might be something of a perk for him, right? Um, but I think at the very least, you can kind of conclude based on their track record that they see these newspapers as nothing more than financial assets to be moved
Okay.
around on a spreadsheet to maximize their profits and the profits for their investors. And that's really what they care about at the end of the day. When I actually spoke to Heath Freeman, got an interview with him, which is rare. He doesn't do many of these, but at one point I asked him, because before I talked to him, I had reached out to a bunch of the reporters that I had talked to at Alden owned newspapers. And I said, if you could ask one question to your boss, what would it be? And a lot of them said something similar, which is ask him what his favorite stories are that his newspapers have recently published. Like just ask him like
Mm.
what are some stories that he's appreciated. And I asked him that and he declined to answer on the record, which, I think to a lot of people would suggest that he's not engaged on or does not care about the actual work these newspapers do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. He didn't even bother going through the motions of, saying, he holds journalism in high esteem and
Yeah.
the robust future. I mean, he didn't even try to pretend. He didn't even go through the motions
and
of going through the
and
motions.
and that's the thing. So I
Yeah,
thought for sure he would. Like when
yeah,
I
yeah.
when we set up the interview and I was preparing for it, I was prepared for him to say the things that you're supposed to say if you're that guy, right? You're the guy who's done a lot of really painful cuts to the newspapers you own. You're supposed to say, "Oh, these cuts are tragic but necessary, and I hold journalism in the highest regard, and I want to place
Right.
these newspapers on a path to a better future." He didn't really say much of any of that. In fact, he seemed almost to regard his reputation for ruthlessness and Alden's reputation for cost cutting as a badge of honor. Like
Hmm.
he it was the thing that distinguished him from the sort of cowardly saps who used to own these newspapers, these generational families, right? He said, they weren't willing to make the tough choices. And the implication was, and I am, right? And so I think that in the world that he inhabits, it being invited as an honored guest to the committee to protect journalists annual dinner is not a huge badge of honor. He doesn't care about that. Like he doesn't care about his standing in the journalism world. What he cares about is maximizing profits. And to the extent that he has kind of his own world where status matters, it's the financial world, it's Wall Street. He wants to be seen as a great hedge fund manager, a great investor. And you do that by making a lot of money, not by turning out respectable products or making these newspapers better or investing in these newsrooms.
So let's just step back for a moment and talk about why this matters. I mean, for people who go, okay, well, why are you, writing an article about newspapers? I mean, that's just one industry; it's a dying industry.
Mhm.
But you've explained that one of the reasons why you wrote this piece was you've been watching politics. We've both been watching what's happened over the last decade, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that you really are convinced that a lot of the problems that we're seeing now, the polarizations, conspiracy theories, the erosion of public trust really can be tracked back to this decline of
Mhm.
the trusted sources, that the disappearance of local and mid-sized newspapers, the gutting of them, has had a tremendous impact on this media ecosystem that we live in right now. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. In fact, I would say that my interest in this can kind of be traced back to a lot of the reporting I've done on conspiracy theories and misinformation and how that's shaped our politics over the last several years. My typical beat is politics. This story was a little off my beat, or it seems to be, but I actually don't think it is. There's a huge body of research that shows that there are downstream consequences when a local newspaper disappears, right? It corresponds with lower voter turnout, increased polarization, a general kind of erosion of civic trust and civic engagement. It makes it much easier for misinformation to spread, conspiracy theories to spread. There's evidence actually that city budgets get bigger and
Sure.
fattier because corruption and dysfunction are allowed to kind of run wild without newspapers there to hold them in check. And actually, it does influence our national politics. There was an analysis by Politico that found that Donald Trump performed best during the 2016 election in places with limited access to local news. And this is what's so important, right? I should step back and just say when I talk about the importance of these newspapers, I'm not necessarily arguing for the the need to continue to print out news on dead tree paper and deliver it to the doorstep of thousands of homes in every city in America, right? I'm kind of ambivalent about or agnostic about whether it needs to be on paper or online. What's important is a busy, bustling newsroom of
Right.
journalists, editors, photographers who are documenting what's happening in the city and
And we're
digging
watchdogs.
into corruption
Yeah.
and yeah, right, doing that work. Um and and what I think is happening when you look at all these problems that you've talked about on your show for years and that we've both been writing about, these problems in our politics, a lot of them come down to the fact that there is no consensus set of facts anymore.
Right.
There's no kind of common starting place that we can have our big debates from, right? And that comes down to the fact that there just aren't as many news outlets, aren't as many journalists helping to establish those facts. Local newspapers, in poll after poll, survey after survey, are the most trusted parts of the media. And so when they die and when they disappear, there's a trickle down effect of distrust across the whole media sector, and that's what we're, I think, dealing with today.
I don't think you can overstate this. I mean, on a number of different levels. I mean, a little bit of my background. I live in Wisconsin because my father was a newspaper man. We moved here when he went to work for the Milwaukee Sentinel, which was owned by the Milwaukee Journal. I was a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal back in the day, back in the early
Mm.
'70s. I was the city hall reporter, so I covered city government along with others, and we covered local government and state government intensively. I mean, you look back at these old newspapers and the degree, the detail of our coverage, the detail of the investigative reporting, of the watchdog reporting.
Hmm.
And now you look at the newspaper and it looks like a shopper. And so you have a number of different consequences. Number one, that you don't have the people who are covering, local government. You don't have the eyes on state government. And what that also means is that you have less civic engagement at the local and state level. And so all politics becomes more national. I mean, I think that's
Yes.
one of them.
Yeah.
You're right about the erosion of truth and trust, but also, back in, a few years ago, when I was a reporter, I mean, everybody knew who the leaders of the community were, prominent citizens, the county executive, people were engaged in all those issues. I don't think that that's the case anymore,
Yes.
in part because of all this. So that when you talk about politics, it's all what's going on, Trump or not Trump, as opposed to
Hmm.
a time when, that was there, but people were citizens of their community and of their states.
And every community is different, and that's the
Right.
problem when these stories get flattened when they're just
Right.
reported in the national news. I mean, you think about everything that's happening in school boards right
Yeah.
now and school board meetings, right? It's a problem that so much of the coverage, such a huge portion of the coverage of these education related, school related issues is coming from cable news, right? Because there's a flattening effect when it's Fox and CNN and MSNBC covering these things instead of the local schools reporter who's been dug in on these issues for years, knows all the players, can provide context and front page stories on a local newspaper. And if people were getting their news on these things from their neighbors who happen to be journalists, I think you'd have a much different situation than you do now, where it's primetime cable blowhards who are fanning the flames of culture war constantly, right?
Well, yes, and I also worry, this may be secondary, but I also worry about the farm team for journalists.
Mm.
That we have a lot of young journalists who work very hard, do outstanding work, but there once was a time when they would have honed their craft in these local and regional newspapers. You'd work for the Milwaukee Journal, and then you'd end up in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but you would have put in a decade or more. And now we have people for national publications who have never reported locally, have never covered a
Hmm.
school board meeting or a city council meeting or a legislative meeting.
Yeah, and
And
it does have an effect. I mean, I'm actually an example of this. I will say that, my local journalism experience came from internships when I was in high school and college,
yeah,
and
immensely important.
right. So, I wrote for the Metro West Daily News in Massachusetts growing up, and I wrote for the Deseret News in Salt Lake City in college. But when it came time to apply for jobs out of college in journalism, I sent in applications to a ton of local newspapers across the country, but they just don't have that many jobs, right? And so what I ended up doing was taking a job in New York City at a
Hmm.
magazine, and I've been in New York and DC ever since. And I actually think that's a hole in my own journalism experience. Like, I wish that I had spent a few years at one of these newspapers covering, being the second or third reporter on City Hall or the state house, or covering police or crime or something like that. Those are important journalistic skills that you just don't get if you go straight into the national media.
Okay, so I want to let's go into your story, because the portrait you paint of what happened to the Chicago Tribune, I think, is just this perfect example of what we're talking about here. And so I want to start there and some of the people that you talked to right after this. Thanks for listening to today's Bulwark podcast, and a special thank you to all of the Bulwark Plus members. We launched Bulwark Plus a year ago, and I don't think we really had any idea back then how fast it would grow, or the kind of challenges we'd all be facing in the post Trump era. If you've been listening to us or reading our newsletters, the in depth pieces on our homepage, you know that we are committed to telling you what we think in a thoughtful, non tribal way. But we're also not going to pretend these are normal times, and we're not afraid to try to make a difference here at the Bulwark. And we intend to keep fighting, because the challenges to democracy are more urgent than ever. None of this would be possible without your support, and we're very grateful. If you haven't signed up yet for Bulwark Plus, please consider becoming part of the Bulwark community. And if you already have, thanks. We think you're in great company. Okay, we are back with McKay Coppins of The Atlantic, who has this absolutely extraordinary cover story about the hedge fund that has been destroying newspapers all across the country. So your piece starts in Chicago with the Chicago Tribune, which, as I was growing up, I just remember the first time that I ever saw the Tribune Tower, which is
Mm.
this just majestic building and kind of a symbol of the power of the Tribune. And it's now a symbol of what's happened to that newspaper, isn't it?
It really is. So I visited Chicago this past summer while working on this story, and I went to see the Tribune Tower. And the history of the Tribune Tower is fascinating. So in 1922, the owner of the Chicago Tribune announced that he was going to build the world's most beautiful office building for this newspaper. And he started a contest for the best architects in the world to submit designs, and he put, lofty quotes about the press and the lobby, and he even directed the Tribune's foreign correspondents to collect fragments from the Great Wall of China and St. Peter's Basilica and all these historical sites, and send them back so they could be embedded in the facade of the tower. And when it was finished in 1925, it was kind of this remarkable architectural spectacle, right? And it stood for the power and prestige of the Chicago Tribune and its central place, not just in Chicago, but in the entire Midwest region. It was one of the most important newspapers in the country. And that, to contrast where the Chicago Tribune is today, the Tribune Tower no longer houses the Chicago Tribune. It's luxury condos now. The actual newsroom is in as I write in the piece, Chipotle-sized office near the printing press, where reporters have to share desks, and it's just really grim. I went there this last summer, and I've just got to say, like, it was even grimmer than I'd imagined.
You were
The,
shocked.
the, the fact that, I mean, this is a newspaper that endorsed Abraham Lincoln. it
Right.
it broke the story of the Treaty of Versailles. It's won dozens of Pulitzer prizes. To see the staff reduced to working in this kind of, tiny cramped office space, it just
The
is such a
size of a
symbol of,
Chipotle.
yeah, it
Yeah.
just it's such a symbol of what is happening to this great paper.
And that story is replicated all around the country, but you then go through what the consequences are. For example, there was a powerful state legislator who resigned amid bribery allegations. The Chicago Tribune did not have a reporter in Springfield to follow the
Hmm.
resulting scandal. I mean, look, I don't think you have to be a journalist to realize how extraordinary that is, or This one, when Chicago went through that brutal crime wave over the summer, the paper had no one on the night shift to listen to the police scanner.
Which again,
Ah,
like
what?
which 10 years ago would have been
Ah,
unthinkable, right? Like
it's
any self-respecting newspaper would have somebody 24 hours, listening
well,
to
of
the police
course.
scanner. You show up where the police are showing up. That's kind of the blocking and tackling of metro reporting. And they weren't able to staff it because they didn't have the resources.
So then your piece starts in Chicago, but it ends in Baltimore, where you also have a tremendously storied newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, which again was kind of legendary. I mean, this was the
Mhm.
wasn't that H.L. Mencken's newspaper,
Yeah, yeah.
the Baltimore Sun. I mean, this was a national, international paper, and it's also been gutted by these folks, hasn't it?
Yeah, and the Baltimore Sun actually was the kind of site of the most aggressive revolt from reporters against Alden. When it looked like Alden was going to buy the paper, the Sun staff basically launched a public relations campaign to rally the city against Alden. They were looking for new owners. They ran editorials. They had rallies to try to basically stop the sale from going through. And they got some traction. They actually found a local philanthropist named Stuart Bainham who wanted to, emerged at the last minute to try to buy the paper from Alden and turn it into a nonprofit. He wasn't able to do that. Alden kind of, at least in his account, sort of torpedoed the deal. And what's left is a dramatically reduced newspaper that once employed hundreds of journalists and is now kind of scraping by, trying to survive. And it's really sad. I actually talked to David Simon,
I know. I
the
thought it was, yeah.
yeah, the creator of The Wire. He spent his formative years as a crime reporter, police reporter at the Baltimore Sun. And he said he made clear that this isn't just Alden, right? The Baltimore Sun, like a lot of newspapers, has been under a succession of hapless or corrupt or greedy owners, right? But Alden is sort of the most ruthless and the most brazen. And what he basically said was, you look at this city, Baltimore, which David Simon knows better than
Yep.
anybody. Baltimore has always had problems. There's always been corruption. There's always been police misconduct, all this stuff that was in The Wire and that he's written about. But he said, back when I was a police reporter there, there was this understanding that if things got really bad, if some government official or cop or whoever was doing really bad stuff, eventually the Baltimore Sun would find out about it and it would end up on the front page, right? And he said today the bad stuff goes on for so long that by the time you get to it, institutions are irreparable or damn near close. And I think that that's a perfect kind of encapsulation of what it means to these cities when their newspapers are gutted.
No, I mean, I think wasn't it Mencken himself who said that conscience is that small voice telling you that somebody may be looking, which is really
Exactly. Yes.
the function, and so in state houses all around the country, people know that no one is looking. You actually, I thought it was very interesting. You had David Simon, who's I'm by the way, I'm convinced The Wire is still the greatest TV show ever,
Hmm.
and its portrayal of journalism is the best I think I've ever seen. And Mencken, talked about what it was like being a columnist in Baltimore, and he called
Life
it
of
the
Kings.
life of kings.
Yeah.
And at the Sun's peak, it employed more than 400 journalists with reporters in London and Tokyo and Jerusalem. Its World War II correspondent brought firsthand news of Nazi concentration camps to American readers. Its editorial page once had the power to make or break political careers in Maryland, and now it is what it is. So,
And
uh,
I want to just pause to say,
yeah,
the Baltimore Sun still has good reporters and editors there, and so does the Chicago Tribune. And since this story has come out, I've seen some pushback from some of the people who are still on staff at these papers who still have pride in their papers, and
sure.
they don't want to see us, digging the grave for the Chicago Tribune or whatever. And I would just say this: the people who have chosen to stick around at these papers and try to continue to do this work should be applauded, right? They're doing
Well, sure.
important work and they're doing good work, but the conditions that they're working under are increasingly impossible. And asking them to cover a city the size of Chicago or Baltimore with the resources that they have is effectively impossible. And so, the Baltimore Sun is continues to break important stories, but on the trajectory that it's on, I think it's an open question how much longer they'll be able to do anything approaching, serious metro journalism.
So a few years ago, I was on a commission that was sort of wrestling with some of these issues, and I don't know that we came up with any answers here. What do you do about the death of local journalism? Because, as you pointed out, the consequences are really profound for democracy, for our civic life. And you go through the various things that have happened in newspapers. You mentioned them. The internet, Craigslist killing all the classifieds, which had a much bigger impact than I think anyone ever imagined at the time.
Hmm.
Google and Facebook, basically hoovering up all of the ad revenue. And then, of course, you have the vultures like Alden who are gutting these newspapers. So I guess the question is that in a free market, if there is a demand for local journalism, what are the prospects of someone stepping in and saying, okay, let's actually try to recreate local journalism? Is the marketplace in a position to come up with alternatives to these gutted newspapers? You know
Mm.
what I'm getting at? I mean, so it's
Yeah.
Baltimore, so
Yep.
that has happened in some places. I suppose you've had billionaires who came in and, a billionaire bought the Washington Post, a billionaire bought the Los Angeles Times, but that's not going to happen everywhere. But
Yeah.
if there's an appetite for local news, shouldn't there be some sort of a way in which the market can respond to that or
Hmm. Yeah.
not?
And there, no, I mean, look, there are active ongoing experiments testing this thesis in markets across the country. The Texas Tribune, the Daily
Yeah.
Memphian, the City in New York.
Mhm.
These are basically digital local news startups that have been built from the ground up in the last decade or so. Most of them are nonprofit. They're funded by a combination of donations, subscriptions, advertisements. So, they are still trying to make money the old fashioned way, but they're also benefiting from other types of funding. And some of them have had success. So to go back to that guy Stuart Bainum I talked to, the philanthropist who tried to buy the Baltimore Sun, he told me that after losing the Baltimore Sun deal, he went through all of these kind of local news startups and spent time talking to the people who are running them. And he said that he was uniformly impressed by the journalism they're producing. They're doing good work. But his biggest takeaway was that they just needed all of them much more funding, right?
Yeah.
That his quote to me was, "You need real capital to move the needle, otherwise you're just peeing in the ocean." And so, what he actually is doing is he's launching a pretty significant challenger to the Baltimore Sun next year in Baltimore. It's going to be called the Baltimore Banner. It's an all digital nonprofit outlet. He's going to start with a newsroom of around 50 journalists, which
Hmm.
is close to the size of the
Yeah.
Baltimore Sun, have an annual operating budget of $15 million, which is fairly unprecedented for a local outfit of this kind. Um, and he basically wants to make this a new publication of record. It's not just going to be government accountability reporting, though that will obviously be important, but it'll also cover sports and art and local restaurants and local culture and all the things that kind of bind a city together, because that's the other thing that you lose when one of these newspapers closes, right? It's these newspapers act as sort of a binding agent for the communities that they're in. And he wants to recreate that. And so this is kind of the biggest experiment of its kind. A lot of people in the industry will be watching it closely to see if he can make it work. He's hoping that within 5 years he can make it self-sustaining through subscriptions and donations, and that's the goal. And I do think there is still a market for it. Even it should be noted that Alden, a lot of the newspapers they've been buying more recently, like the Chicago Tribune, actually were still turning profits when Alden bought them. And they still, decided to do dramatic cost cutting to increase the profit margins. But there clearly is still a market for this kind of journalism. But what I worry about, this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, is that, you know, readers will lose their taste for it if they go too long without serious local news outlets, right? Eventually, people will build new habits and become used to getting all their news from cable or talk radio or Facebook or whatever. And they'll lose their ability to even care about what's happening day to day in city hall or at the school board.
I sense that that is happening. On the other hand, take a more optimistic point of view. If we go back to, your description of what their game plan is, gut the staff, sell the newspaper's real estate holdings, jack up subscriptions, drain the papers dry until the readers bolt and the paper shrivels. That means that at some point out there, there is a hole in the marketplace. There is
Mm-hmm.
something if people have not lost the habit. Because as soon as you mention that, I'm thinking that for many people of a certain age, getting the newspaper was simply a habit. It was something that you inherited from your parents and your
Yep.
grandparents. It
Yep.
showed up. You just did it. It was like having milk delivered to your house, which also no longer happens. But if you get out of that habit, if that institutional memory, fades and dies, then it will be hard to build it all from scratch. So it's not just building the organization. It's building the habit and the appetite and
Mm-hmm.
the level of interest. So that's a significant challenge.
And I think that that's going to be the challenge that the Baltimore Sun faces, and that's kind of the goal, right? They have to create new habits. This isn't going to be a
Right.
newspaper that winds up on your doorstep. It's going to be an online, a website with various other media channels that you subscribe to, and they need to create new habits for a new generation of Baltimore readers. And if they can do that, then it's possible to do it everywhere. And that is the goal. And I do think it need, whether it's the Baltimore Banner or somebody else, a lot of
Yeah.
energy and thought needs to go into how do we teach a new generation of readers how to engage with local news on a daily basis, because if we don't think about that, all of these projects are probably going to fail.
Okay, so let me just change subject for a moment, and I'm going to ask you about something that you did 6 years ago. Okay, you
Oh,
can remember
okay.
6 years ago.
Uh-oh.
Okay, so you wrote a book called the Wilderness: Deep
Hmm.
Inside the Republican Party's Combative, Contentious, Chaotic Quest to Take Back the White House. That was published in December 2015. I don't know that anybody could have predicted that that was going to be Donald Trump, but you look. I'm sure you've thought about that book. What is the most surprising thing that happened? I mean, you did this deep dive into Republican politics, what they were talking about, who they were, what the jockeying was like. What has surprised you the most in 6 years?
Who? It's a
And
big
you're not
question.
confined. Yeah, I know. And, I guess part of it is it was bad, but I had no idea it would get that bad. What would, what would you say?
Yeah, I guess like what I would say is that yeah, I've obviously thought a lot about that book
Yeah.
because basically I was reporting that book and writing it in between the end of the 2012 election and the beginning of the 2016 election. And the thesis that I put forward was that this was a and I think this is actually held up pretty well, that this was a kind of generationally defining moment for the Republican Party, right? They were at a crossroads. They were trying to figure out how they could keep winning national elections with a changing country and with everything that had happened since the Reagan years. How do they become a dominant national party again or stay that way? And what I wrote about was all these guys who were preparing to run for president. And I think what I wrote about was their kind of I wrote about their ideological battles,
Yeah.
right? So there was a lot about Rand Paul and the kind of libertarian moment the party went through. And then there was Paul Ryan's fiscal conservatism and Ted Cruz's Tea Partyism. And I profiled these guys as individuals, and I also wrote about their ideas, and I wrote about their kind of failures to live up to their ideals. But it was all about their ideas. And I guess probably what I was most surprised by was how quickly this entire generation of leaders in the Republican Party were willing to kind of
Yeah.
dispense with these
That's good.
ideas
Right.
to get in line behind this guy Donald Trump, who is a character in the book as well, but not nearly as big of a character as he should have been in retrospect. But like I think I just wasn't prepared for how quickly Paul Ryan would throw up his hands,
Oh,
right,
no.
and say, okay, and I'm getting on board the Trump train, or Marco Rubio, who was had this really gripping life story about immigration and growing up in an immigrant community, like, got behind
Yeah.
Donald Trump. I think it's not that I thought any of these guys were beyond, compromises to their ideals. I wrote about a lot of them in those compromises in the book. I just think I was surprised by how little their stated ideas, their ideologies ended up mattering.
I think that's a great point. I guess that was I was also under the impression that politics was about ideas, and now it looks incredibly naive that in fact, maybe the ideas or the ideologies were this thin crust on
Hmm.
something else, but they did jettison them so quickly. And I guess I look back on that period and go, okay, so this was a fundamental misunderstanding about our politics.
Hmm.
Those of us that were wonky thought it was about the ideas, those ideas were serious, when it was about something more visceral, ideas, attitudes, whatever. To watch a reality TV host come and just brush them aside. I mean, just
Hmm.
brush them aside. I mean, I can remember looking at that stage, the debate stage, and you're thinking, "Wow, what an incredible collection of talent." And yet, remember this? I'm sorry,
Yeah, no, I
and,
do.
but if you look at that same picture now, you go, "Wow, what a collection of losers."
Yeah,
I mean,
I know, I know, I know. And I think the other thing is that these, like, I'm trying to figure out how to put this. Like, the r- for so long it seemed like the the defining kind of battle inside the Republican Party was between the so-called establishment and the so-called conservative movement,
yeah,
right? That was the key tension. And I can't tell you how many thousands, tens of thousands of words I've written about that battle. And I think that what's interesting is that, if I go back and look at that book and I look at if I look back through my notes and see who my best sources were,
mhm,
a lot of those people who were more establishment figures have become the fringe, right? And the people
right.
who seemed like the fringe at the time are now the establishment, right? And so,
Yeah.
when I look back at that book, so many of the themes of that book were people, these political leaders, people like Bobby Jindal, who's a Rhodes
Oh,
Scholar
wow,
and
yeah.
finds himself, basically playing culture war with the Duck Dynasty guys to try to carve out a space for himself in the Republican primary. All these guys are kind of trying to contend with the reality that they don't fully understand the base of their party, right? And I think that ended up being true just in ways that nobody could have predicted.
I think that's the key is that as well as many of these candidates, just fundamentally did not understand the base of their party. They thought they did, and everything was a rude surprise. No, it's always good to go back and think, okay, what was I thinking back then?
Yep. Yeah.
Why did I think that Marco Rubio would be a strong stand-up guy? It's like, or, I mean, it's strange. Or Lindsey Graham. Well, at least he's a
Mm,
strong, independent-minded maverick, and we could sort of go
I
through
know.
all of them,
I know.
and
I know.
none of them seem plausible. McKay Coppins, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it very much. This is an absolutely fascinating story for me. I think for people who are concerned about democracy, about our politics, for me personally, as a former recovering journalist, the cover story in the November issue of the magazine is a secretive hedge fund is gutting newspapers. It's an extraordinary story, extraordinary job. So thank you for writing the piece and for coming on the podcast today, McKay Coppins.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.